Hello and welcome everyone. We'll go ahead and get started now. My name is Pauline de Guzman and I'm the Manager of International Student Services at ISPO. Presenting alongside me today is ISPO's Assistant Director of Student Services, Trisha Tran-Schuler. We are so excited to have you all today. We hope you're all well and in good health. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode on discussing how to support international students during COVID-19. Today is the first episode in this webinar series. Each episode highlights a different impact area, but today we'll be focusing on what options international students have after they graduate and how the pandemic has impacted their ability to make these important decisions given so much uncertainty. Before we begin, I'll cover some housekeeping items. First, you're on listen only mode, so you can hear us, but we can't hear you. Also, we're recording, so if you are not able to make this webinar, of course, we will have it available for you in 48 hours at iwebinars.ucsd.edu. And lastly, please ask questions. We want to hear from you. Also joining us today to answer your questions in chat is Shelly Taskin, International Student Advisor at ISPO. We'll also be leaving some room at the end for some questions, so you can ask us there. If after the webinar you have some questions, no problem. You can always email Trisha and I directly, and our contact information will be available at the end of the webinar. Okay, so today's agenda, we'll talk about timeline. When do students need to take action on their immigration records? Student concerns, what are we hearing from students? Given current regulatory guidance from U.S. immigration and health and safety conditions, what options do they have? And lastly, we'll highlight some tips and resources available for you when advising international students. We have a ton to cover, so I'm going to jump right in. Okay, so for timeline, when advising a student who is nearing the end of their academic program, depending on their current situation, their timeline and urgency may differ. So as an advisor, it's helpful for me to understand which situations might warrant a more urgent response. First, it's always a good idea, of course, to recommend that students speak directly with ISPO. But a simple way to determine urgency is to categorize students into two piles. So the first is completing program of study. If a student is they're making normal progress towards completion of their degree, they're planning to graduate, or likely in their final quarter, this group will also include students who are already on OPT and are nearing the end of their OPT end dates and work authorization. So that's our first group. Our second category are students who are not completing their program of study. So this might be a student who is withdrawing from their program, taking a leave of absence, or maybe are being suspended or academically disqualified. So we'll take a look at each of these categories to determine timeline. So for those who are planning to complete a program of study, those students will have a grace period. F1 students have a 60-day grace period after their last date of enrollment or their last date of approved OPT, while J1 students have 30 days. So this is the timeline in which they need to make or take their next step. If they don't take the necessary steps within this grace period, then their immigration status basically will automatically complete and they will not be able to take any actions after that fact. They'll have to take some extra steps and contact ISPO if they do lapse after their grace period. So if a student is not completing their program of study, they are either withdrawing, taking a leave of absence, a gap quarter, or they're being suspended or academically disqualified, then their turnaround time, their grace period is much shorter. It is 15 days. Okay, and so this clock starts from either the last date of enrollment or the first day of the quarter of leave, whichever is later for those students who are withdrawing or taking a leave of absence. And then for those who are facing suspension or disqualification, it is from either the date of suspension or disqualification, or if they are planning to appeal decision date. So whichever is later. And again, I want to remind all of you to please ask questions through our Q&A chat here. If I need to clarify any of this information, I'm happy to do so. So now I want to go over some concerns that a lot of our students have voiced to us amidst this pandemic. And I think it's important for all of our campus partners to really be aware of what these concerns are, so that you can keep them in mind when advising international students. Okay. The most popular, of course, that we hear from our students is travel restrictions. So students are unable to book departing flights back to their home countries and are often up against flight cancellations again and again, time and time again. And so they're having to remain in the US and figure out ways to extend their visa or student status here. There are also conflicting decisions of wanting to remain in the US to complete their programs of study, while their families back home are preferring that they return home, for safety and health concerns. So that's a common concern. Another common one is synchronous learning and access. So the need for asynchronous learning. Though courses are held here at 1 p.m., students are having to get up at 4 a.m. in their home countries to attend classes and take quizzes, which really just is not ideal. And it's causing them to, really fall behind when it comes to coursework. Some students also don't have access to the same resources that they would here in the US due to firewalls and VPN issues. And also, if a student is able to successfully depart the US before they're really able to go back into their cities and provinces and so forth, they are required to self-quarantine for a certain period of time. So many of them, for 2 weeks after they arrive into their home countries, are in a hotel, with interrupted internet access, and that again causes a lot of delay in their abilities to complete coursework. Another is engagement and remote instruction. So our international students are coming here to the US for the purpose of in-person instruction. Online platforms are, again, not favorable for many of our students, and a lot of them have expressed, the desire to want to take fall quarter as a gap quarter, and in hopes that in the winter quarter, in-person classes will resume again and that they can continue their programs. Another that we see is maintaining their Form I-20. So for those who have interruptions in research and completion towards graduation, they're needing to extend their Form I-20s so that they can have more time to complete their programs. But in order to extend your program end dates on your I-20s, it requires that you provide funding or proof of funding. And so we are up against departments having to provide those kinds of, departments having to provide those kind of support letters, or for reasons that their home country's government offices are closed, and so they're unable to get those bank statements, or for some reason their main financial source, like parents or their companies, are now closed or losing jobs. And so we see these from domestic students as well, but in order for them to obtain these documents to then submit to our office so that they can maintain their visa status, then becomes an issue. And of course, plans for the fall. How will remote instruction affect their visas? There's a lot of uncertainty right now with US immigration of being able to travel back to the US in the fall if their courses are all remote. Will California Border Patrol or just Border Patrol allow them to re-enter, knowing that all of their classes are remote anyway? So these are some concerns that a lot of our students have voiced to us, and I think it's important to have these in mind when you're advising and meeting with international students. So let's go ahead and let's look at some options now that students will have if they find themselves in these situations. Okay, so Trisha, let's get your thoughts. What kind of advice do we give our students who find themselves in these situations with these concerns, depending on if they are completing their program of study or planning to perhaps withdraw or take a leave of absence?
Yeah, thank you, Pauline. So let's take a look at that first bucket that Pauline referred to. So those students who are completing their program of study, what options do they have at the completion of their program? So during the normal non-COVID-19 period, they have all of these options. But of course, due to COVID-19, these options are being impacted. So before the end of their 60-day grace period for F1 students or 30-day grace period for J1 students, the student has to take one of these options in order to maintain their F1 status. So they can choose to depart the US before the 60th or 30th day. Of course, Pauline mentioned the issues with travel. Flight availability is very limited. Flights are being canceled and deferred. So students who are planning to leave within the 60 days, thinking that they can leave, unfortunately, sometimes it doesn't work out. And then they're scrambling for what their other options are. So other options, they can file for OPT, which is optional practical training. It's a type of work authorization for F1 students after they have completed their academic program. The thing with OPT is that the student has to be in the US at the time of filing. So at the end of winter term, as well as coming into the spring term, a lot of students were making that difficult decision about wanting or needing to leave the US. So for those students who are enrolled in remote coursework and are outside of the US, this is a very difficult decision for them, because if they're outside the US, they may not be eligible to apply for OPT. At this time, if there are students who are struggling to decide, should I leave, should I stay, it could impact their eligibility for OPT, because again, they have to be in the US at the time of filing. Students who've been accepted into another degree program at UCSD have the option to also change their degree level on their I-20. So they apply for a change of level I-20. Of course, this is something that most students are already aware of. They have to have already been accepted into a higher degree program. So for example, a bachelor student who's been accepted to a master's program, or a MS student who's been accepted into a PhD program for fall. And then another option for students here in the US is transferring their CVIS record out to another institution. So let's say a student has been accepted to Carnegie Mellon for the fall term. They can transfer their CVIS record out. So under normal circumstances, international students are required to start at their new program of study at the new institution within 5 months of ending at their prior school. Due to COVID-19, SEVP is allowing students to exceed that 5-month period. So for example, we see students who graduated in the winter term. So at the end of March was their last day of study at UCSD, but they've been accepted into a program of study that starts in the fall. And that's usually more than 5 months from when they ended at one program to when they're starting. So again, an exception, an accommodation is being made for these students to be able to transfer their records out to another institution, even though there's more than a 5-month period between the two institutions. So, that is definitely a benefit to our students at this time for those students who've been accepted to another program of study. And then finally, this option to change their visa status. So this is probably not an option that most students are considering. However, it is something that we will consult with students on if they just don't have any of the above options. So this option is basically remaining in the US and applying to the US Citizenship and Immigration Services to change their F1 or J1 student status to a tourist. And really, this is just to give them additional time to try to leave the US. Most of the students that we've talked to who we've suggested this as an option, it's really that they've been trying to leave, they're not eligible for OPT or degree level for, or transferring out. And by applying to USCIS, they can remain in the US while they have a pending application. And it's just buying them time to find a flight to depart the US. And of course, always refer the students to ISPO. We don't expect all of our campus partners to understand or know all the ins and outs of the regulations for F1 and J1 status. So please do use us as a resource for these students. And then let's take a look at options for those students who are withdrawing or not completing their program of study. Oh, and before I move on to this one, I did want to mention that the grace period, these options for students that are in their 60-day grace period, these are also options for students that are completing their OPT or STEM OPT period. So students who have graduated from UCSD, they're on OPT or STEM OPT. At the end of that work authorization, they have their 60-day grace period, and they hopefully can opt to take one of these actions. Okay, so let's take a look at that other bucket of students, the students who are not able to complete their program of study, who might need to take a leave of absence. So it's a little more complicated with these students because as Pauline mentioned, these students have less time to take action, right? They only have 15 days to try to depart or transfer, change status, whatever the case may be. So, I think it was a really great suggestion from Pauline, to kind of determine which bucket these students are in. Are they completing their program or are they not completing? And if they're unable to complete, they're suspended, disqualified, withdrawing for some reason, please do refer them over to ISPO as soon as possible.
Okay, thanks, Tricia. So some resources and tips that we want to highlight when advising international students. First, of course, I know you all do this already, but please advise thoughtfully. A lot of our international students, before COVID-19 already required a level of adjustment to US life and just campus life. Now with COVID-19, they may need additional support or engagement. For those who you feel might need that level of engagement, please refer them to globalhub.ucsd.edu, which is for featuring virtual engagement opportunities for international students.
Okay, and then when you're meeting with students, ask them questions. When I'm meeting with students, one of the first questions I ask is, where are you? Are you currently in the US? Are you outside the US? Are you staying safe? And then finally, do you feel supported, or what else can we do to help support you? The students are really feeling a lot of, like all of our students and us, feeling so much uncertainty, and it's hard to make decisions. So, I always want to try to arm them with the knowledge that they need, but also to acknowledge for us that, sometimes we're still waiting for guidance from SAVP. And at this time, this is how we're advising to the best of our knowledge at this time. Oh, and one other tip in terms of advising students and asking them questions. We do have an intercultural communication tips handout, which we'll be sending out to you all at the end of this presentation as part of our survey.
Great, thanks, Trisha. And as new guidance and regulations are made available, we update our COVID FAQ page. It's primarily for students in two categories, if they're inside of the US or outside of the US, and then depending on where they are, we talk about travel, restrictions, employment, questions about employment, enrollment, and any other support services that they may need. So as advisors, you're also able to refer to that page. We'll send that out also at the end of this presentation. But please refer students to the COVID FAQ page. We update this regularly as we receive new guidance and evaluate how they might impact our students.
And then I wanted to highlight some of the resources that ISPO might have available to students who are experiencing financial need. So we've been really lucky to be able to get some funding to address basic needs, housing, and non-tuition and fee related financial need for international students. So as you are meeting with international students, if you find out or discover that they have basic needs or housing non-tuition related financial issues, please, you can shoot us an email with the student's name and PID, and we'll follow up directly with the student, or you can refer the student on to us to find out about some resources. So for example, one of our programs that we've actually had for quite a while now, it's called iTable. It's a program where we're able to provide grocery gift cards to students so that they can purchase food. But we have additional resources for students. So please do refer them onto us so that we can utilize those funds.
Right, and I know in the past, international students usually are not able to avail a lot of financial assistance programs that exist, but now with COVID-19, there is an increased need for our international students for financial assistance, and so right through the iTable program and our case management team, those are made available. Then lastly, if you have any students who do need immediate attention, please refer them to ISPO. We are continuing virtual Zoom advising hours. Students can contact us at icontact.ucsd.edu, which has our mock form for students who want to send us an email. It also has our links for general and employment advising sessions there. For you as advisors, if you want to get a hold of us and chat, we are available through Zoom calls and chats. We also use Teams now, and so you can also give us a call through Teams or chat us through Teams. And if you're in communication with a student, please feel free to copy an ISPO advisor. Trisha and I will make our emails available after this presentation. All right. Okay, so we received some really great questions in our chat today, so I wanted to take some time to answer some of those. Let's see. Trisha, the first is from Stephanie Matthews. Thank you, Stephanie. Her question is, do students need to be in the US during the entire duration while the OPT application is pending and is submitted to USCIS? On the website, you all say it is highly recommended that they do. So what should a student be aware of if after filing their OPT, they need to travel?
Hi, Stephanie. That's a great question. So yes, as I mentioned in the presentation, students have to be inside the US in order to submit the application to USCIS. But once they've submitted the application to USCIS, technically they can travel, they can depart the US. We normally advise against it because departing from the US could be seen as abandonment of the application. But at the same time, they do have the option to travel and re-enter. So I've never, in my 10 years, I've never seen a denial based on a student departing the US while an OPT is pending. But the student really does have to be careful, because if they're outside the US and wanting to re-enter while OPT is pending, they need to re-enter the US with a copy of their OPT receipt. The OPT receipt can only be sent to a US address that the student indicates on their OPT application. So they usually then will have to coordinate with a friend here in the US to mail them the what's called the I-797 receipt notice. So they have that on hand when they are requesting reentry back to the US. And so that's when OPT is still pending with USCIS. Now, if they're outside the US and USCIS has adjudicated their OPT has been approved, USCIS will mail them to a US address, what's called the EAD card, the Employment Authorization Document. And in that case, then, in order to re-enter the US, the student has to have their EAD card. So they have to have a friend mail them the EAD card from the US. And they also have to have verification that they're re-entering the US for employment purposes. So they should have a job offer letter in order to re-enter. So hopefully that answers your question. It is possible to travel, even though we normally caution students against it, but they have the option to do it. They just have to make sure they have appropriate documentation to re-enter.
Mm-hmm. And so, Stephanie, this is for students, right, who are already past their program end date. So on their I-20, their program end date is in the past. And so when they're trying to re-enter, you know, U.S. Immigration is saying, what is your purpose for re-entering the U.S. if you aren't working? And so that's the reasoning why the student needs to have that approved EAD card and also that offer letter to kind of show purpose for re-entering the U.S. Okay. The next question, Tricia, is from Kate Edwards. Can you talk about SEVIS transfers from other U.S. institutions, those students who did prior degrees, and starting graduate programs here at UCSD, and the time period gap allowed between both programs? What if the student is currently outside of the U.S.?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So if a student is inside the U.S., as I mentioned before, normally they are allowed a 5-month gap or what's called a transfer period in between their previous institution and the start at their new institution. However, due to COVID-19, there's a little bit more flexibility, and SEVP has allowed for more than a 5-month gap. However, the student does have to start at the new institution at the next available start date beyond that 5 months. So if the student has been accepted into a fall program of study, they need to start at that fall program of study. They can't just keep deferring their admissions to a next one. And then the question is, what if the transfer student is outside of the US? So what if the student is transferring their SEVIS record and wants to start their program of study at UCSD and they're outside? So there has been very recent SEVP guidance specifically regarding transfer students. And the guidance is basically indicating that in order to re-enter the US, the student needs to be resuming in-person coursework. So for a transfer student who's been accepted as a grad student at UCSD in the fall, it would be best if they were enrolled in at least one in-person course in order to re-enter the US in time for the fall term.
Mm-hmm.
If they're outside the US and they're only taking remote coursework for the fall, that could impact the start date on their I-20. And we don't know for sure yet, it may need to be deferred to the winter term. We're still waiting for clear guidance from SEVP regarding fall term. Pauline, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so we're actually addressing our newly admitted students in this question, right? So for those who are newly admitted students who have been accepted to begin their program this fall quarter, I know that the pre-arrival team right now who are issuing immigration documents for My-20s and DS 2019s for our new admits are still issuing start dates for the fall quarter, just in case students are able to book visa interviews back home in their home country. Right now, consulates and embassies are closed, but they are starting to schedule visa interviews for those who want to attempt to obtain an F1 or a J1 visa to begin their program this fall. If they are successfully able to get a visa before the fall quarter starts, and if they have classes where they can register in person, then they may seek entry to enter the US. I know just from what we've been hearing, there's some talk that some consulates and embassies abroad who are approving or who are reviewing F1 visa applications are asking students for proof of enrollment, showing that they are going to take in on-campus courses for the fall. And so, yeah, there's just a lack of guidance at the moment about what we are supposed to do in terms of maintaining their program start dates on their For My 20s given remote instruction. So I'm hoping that in the next few months, right, Trisha, we can get that kind of guidance, because I know our students are asking a lot of questions too about what they should do in the fall. If they should stay here, as a continuing student, maybe in a BSMS program, or wanting to do a new program here at UCSD, or transferring to their new institutions. I also want to point out that each institution might interpret this differently. So if you are here at UCSD, we will interpret it as soon as we receive more guidance. But if a student is transferring out, let's say they got accepted into graduate studies at Columbia might interpret this differently as well. So though this guidance exists, it's really important that students talk to ISPO or the international office at their new institutions. Thank you, Kate, for that question. Okay, and then I think we have some time for additional questions, but one from Lisa Hampton. Any advice for graduating international students looking for work in the US? Trisha.
Yeah, we actually just had a webinar yesterday that was co-hosted with the Career Center, and we had about 130 international students show up for that. So it let us know that this type of advice is wanted by our international students. So, we generally will refer students to the Career Center for their resources there when students are looking for jobs. Right, the Career Center does such a great job with mock interviews and all of that. In terms of the immigration side of things, we want to make sure that international students understand the type of work authorization that they need to work in the US. So, while they are a student in their program of study, they would most likely apply if they're going to be working off campus somewhere. They need to understand work authorization called CPT, Curricular Practical Training. If they're graduating and want to take advantage of work authorization, then it's OPT, Post-Completion Optional Practical Training. So I guess my advice is making sure that students understand the work authorization that they're eligible for, and their resources over at Career Center.
Great. And Lisa, also tomorrow I will be posting the recording of yesterday's webinar. It was geared for students, but we did invite faculty and staff to attend as well. So I will share that recording with you all tomorrow once it's available. And I know that Jenna Rock and Julia Hoffman gave some great advice at yesterday's webinar. I also want to share that students should check on our COVID FAQ page for the type of work, right, Tricia, the type of work that they can engage in. So a lot of our students have questions about, is remote work still work? If I'm working online, can I do that? Do I have to update anything on my Form I-20 or report anything differently if I'm working remotely? So we answer all of those questions on our COVID FAQ page. So I urge that they review it. Okay. And then let's see what other questions we have. Where can I find a link to this recording? I will have it posted Monday morning on iwebinars.ucsd.edu for any of you who missed it. Okay, we have a few more minutes here. Does anyone have any other questions or would like for us to clarify any of the information that we presented on?
Oh, there's one, Pauline, I see one more question that came in. What advice is given to continuing students who wish to leave the country for the summer and are uncertain about whether to return to campus for fall? Are there recommendations to stay in case there are issues of border entry? Yeah, this is a tough one because students are asking for advice, and you know, like Pauline has mentioned, there are just so many concerns and factors that play into the decisions that students have to make. So yeah, there is definitely the concern that if a student leaves, that they may have difficulty re-entering the U.S. In time for the fall term to start, right? The U.S. consulates and embassies are closed right now. If a student has an expired visa, it's going to be honest, it's going to be very difficult for them to renew their visa in time for the fall. And you know, these are really only consideration or decisions that the students can make. This did bring to mind just one resource that I wanted to share with you all is housing, on-campus housing, and you might all be aware of this, is that UCSD housing is being made available for students who may need it over the summer. So I believe it's they pay on a night-by-night or day-by-day basis. Just so that you're aware of that option.
Right. And we can share that link as well. It's a great question, Jerry. And also, so Jerry, of course, we would advise students, you know, to prioritize and really take into consideration what is best for them personally, taken safe and healthy, or making sure that they are safe and healthy in any decision that they make. If a student does talk to us and ask us this question, we will, of course, say, you know, what is best for you, take it to consideration, all of the factors. But if you do decide that you want to leave for the summer and are unable to return for the fall quarter, there are ways that we can reissue a new I-20 for them to return and resume on-campus instruction for the winter. So it's not like if they leave, everything is, you know, done. They can't resume their courses and return to the U.S. eventually. There is a way. If on-campus instruction resumes in the winter, we can issue new documents and kind of walk them through that process. So there are options, but again, everything is case by case depending on who the student is, if they have a visa, a valid visa or not, and you know, if they're going to be completing their program this year, or maybe this quarter even. And so it's a lot to consider, and so I urge you to all please, you know, refer those students to us.
Oh, I did also want to add just one thing about the summer term. So summer is an academic break. So international students, they're not required to be enrolled in the summer. So, you know, when we talked about that 15-day grace period for students who are not completing their program of study, or if a student is considering a leave of absence, They have the summer. We will not take any action on their I-20 or CVIS record throughout the summer. Mm-hmm. So they have time, to think about taking that leave in the fall. They don't have to make a decision right after the spring term if they're a continuing student.
And so for those students who are remaining in the U.S., right, they're here, they're enrolling in remote coursework for the fall quarter, we will be able to maintain those students' student statuses in their Form I-20. So they are able to remain here if they're already here to continue into the fall quarter remotely. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then another question, a student asked me this once. Once your OPT is approved, your EAD card is your EAD card is received, perhaps it's mailed to a friend's US address. Does the student have to be in the US to work, or could they work remotely outside of the US? Trisha?
Yes, so SEVP has addressed this in their guidance during COVID-19 era. Mm-hmm. So they did clarify that yes, a student on OPT can work outside the US. They did clarify that with as long as there is either like the employer has an office abroad, or that the student's employer can continue to maintain the practical overseeing the practical training, instruction, and program while the student is abroad. That as long as they can oversee that remotely while the student is abroad, the student is eligible to work abroad.
Right, and at yesterday's webinar, Jenna Rock highlighted some great resources for students to search for international work, remote work, and so forth. So I will share that webinar again with you all. Okay, if there are any other questions? Oh, okay, so for Kate, will one in-person required class be enough for UCSD? I think you're asking this in reference of the student needing to take in-person coursework to return to the US for the fall quarter or enter the US. We're not sure. We haven't gotten those types of questions yet from students, and current guidance doesn't address how many classes. It just says remote if you are taking classes in person, so it doesn't really clarify that. But as soon as we do receive more guidance, we'll update you all, and also update the COVID FAQ page. Okay, well, I would like to thank you all for attending our first episode of this webinar series. You can email Trisha and I for more information if you do have any follow-up questions. I hope that this information does provide you with some context of how you can better support our international community. I do urge you all to attend episode 2. In episode 2, we do talk about newly admitted students and kind of the difficulties and concerns they're facing now. We'll definitely go over transfers and what the fall quarter will look like for them if they're enrolling full-time or enrolling on campus or remotely. So please do attend then. That webinar will be featuring our Assistant Director, Gabriella Hoffman. And the link to that episode registration will be made available to you all shortly. Also, please visit ISPO's website for the most up-to-date COVID-19 information for international students. After the end of this webinar, you will be receiving an email with a survey link. Please fill it out, tell us how we did today, and if there are any other topics that you'd like us to cover for future webinar series. Also, all of the resources that we did refer to in today's presentation will be made available in that email. Okay, on behalf of all of our staff at ISPO, we thank you all for your continued support. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and take care. Thanks, everyone. Bye.